Okay, well, welcome back, the faithful attenders, to the latest of the joint seminars in Macau Studies and History and Heritage that are co-hosted by the Fundación Rui Cunha and in collaboration with the University of St. Joseph's Department of History and Heritage. It's a particular pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Stacey Ford from Hong Kong U to talk about Macau's moving images, screening the SAR in the 21st century. One of my better claims to fame is that in the early 1990s, I was in my office and one of the office staff came and banged on the door and said, "There's somebody from America on the phone." And because I was in American history and involved with American studies, whenever anything came up vaguely relating to the United States, they would come and find me and ask me to do something about it. This was a phone call from a lady I had never met who was considering moving to Hong Kong, where her husband had been offered a job, and wanted to find out if there was scope for her to teach in history or women's studies in Hong Kong. And I said, well, if she came to, and she was planning to come to Hong Kong, so I said, okay, I'll be happy to meet with you and have lunch and discuss this. And that was the first time that I ever met Stacey Ford. And I gather that her talk with me basically decided her husband's next career move, because she decided that there probably would be something for her to do in Hong Kong. Now, looking back to the early 1990s, the University of Hong Kong was still caught in something of a Victorian time warp, where it came to women's studies and women's history. I was working in a rather old-fashioned department, and one that moreover was in the middle of a bitterly fought election for the head of department. And against these odds, and with the help of some friends in the department who were willing to back me when I said, well, she's working in women's history and American history, and I think she would be a good person I was then to bring in. I was then asked, is there such a thing as women's history? Is it worth studying women's history? Won't that unbalance the department? So I said I didn't think that one course in women's history in a department with over a dozen teachers, each doing their own courses, was going to alter the balance in the department so drastically that we would become unrecognizable. So probably one of my greatest claims to fame is that I managed to be the thin end of the wedge in helping to bring women's studies to Hong Kong. Stacey would become a very close friend of mine. She already had a doctorate in the history of education from, I think, Columbia. However, she decided that she needed to get a second doctorate in history.
Because of all those men who were suspicious of me, right?
Well, but it did come from Columbia. So she began work on a doctorate in women's history, which would ultimately become this book, Troubling American Women, which was the first study of American women in both Hong Kong and also in Macau. In terms of Macau, it looks in particular at Rebecca Kinsman, who was an American trader's wife living here in the 1840s, and also at someone you've probably heard of, Harriet Lowe, who was in the early 1830s. Her diary is, I think, Macau's answer to Bridget Jones's diary.
That's funny.
She was looking for Mr. Right. Unfortunately, when she found him, he didn't have enough money. So she went back to the United States and ultimately married someone of whom her family approved, but it wasn't a particularly successful marriage, inasmuch as he had what are now, I believe, called mental health issues and alcoholism issues. So the family ended up, in the end, supporting her anyway. So this was Stacey's first book. She also developed a very strong interest in film studies, and this Mabel Cheung Yun Ting's An Autumn's Tale is her second book, and Stacey is now at work on a third. She has also been a leading light in women's organizations in Hong Kong and at the University of Hong Kong, though I have to say that in terms of the university scene, I'm not sure how really different Hong Kong U is from when I started out there. Admittedly, when I started out there, it was pretty much the early Stone Age. I was normally asked where my husband was. People coming out to Hong Kong got a small baggage allowance for themselves and a large baggage allowance for their spouse, because it was expected that the wife would have a lot more baggage than her husband. And a lot of people seemed to think that if I hadn't got a male appurtenance, then I must be very unhappy. And if I wasn't very unhappy, then there must be something really wrong with me. So we've been through a lot of battles and a lot of experiences at Hong Kong U. Most of the stories are probably stories one perhaps shouldn't tell in public. But Stacey and I have been friends and allies through a lot of different developments in Hong Kong U and beyond. So when I was asked to take over this seminar series at USJ, she was one of the first people I thought of as somebody whom I should invite over. We didn't see each other for something like 3 years. during the pandemic, though we were always in touch about this, that, or the other. So one of the nice things for me about the borders opening again was that I was able to catch up with Stacey and her husband and their ever-growing and ever more complicated family.
So complicated.
They started out with 2 sons when they came to Hong Kong, but by now, how many grandchildren?
5.
5 grandchildren. And you even finally managed to pick up a granddaughter, or is it 2 now?
We have 3 granddaughters now.
Good Lord.
2 grandsons and 3.
No longer outnumbered.
We're not outnumbered.
The only woman in your family for quite a long time. So tonight, Stacey is going to be talking not about, well, you might be talking about women in Macau, but in particular about Macau's cinema screening the SAR in the 21st century. And with that, I will hand over to you. Is she going to need the mic as well, or is it just my mic?
I think, am I okay? Are you? It's picking up all right. Thank you. First of all, Priscilla, that was a most kind introduction, and it actually sets the stage a little bit. You have a sense of my work, but I am also very grateful to the Rui Cunha Foundation and to University of St. Joseph's for co-sponsoring the talk. And she's opened a door here tonight. Thank you to all of you for being here, to those who are on the live stream and who will listen later. It is a Thursday night at the end of a long week. And for those of you who are students, a long academic year. So thank you for being here. My plan is to chat about some recent work that I am doing for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. But what has become really apparent to me in preparing for tonight is that Macau, the cinema of Macau, particularly co-productions, mainland Macau, Hong Kong co-productions, is a hole in my work. It's a gap in my work that has been missing. So I will talk mostly about the co-production economy and representations of women and men, and in some cases, gender non-binary characters in cinema. But as Priscilla has mentioned as well, my contact with Macau goes way back. And so when I was thinking about tonight, in some respects, that's not Harriet Lowe, that is Gina Marchetti. But Gina Marchetti is another longtime friend and colleague who was at Hong Kong U and involved in many of the same enterprises that Priscilla and I have been involved in as well. And she wrote a book in 1993, the same year that I came to Hong Kong, called Romance and the Yellow Peril: Race, Sex, and Discursive Strategies in Hollywood Fiction. And she wrote about, not about Macau, but a lot about Hong Kong and a lot about Hollywood Hong Kong and Hollywood Asian connections in cinema. And again, the term Orientalism, I'm sure, is familiar to many, if not all of you. This idea, the ways in which the West, and again, these terms, West, Asia, they're problematic, they're messy, right? But Hollywood definitely has had an outsized impact on representing people and places. So Gina writes, Hollywood's romance with Asia tends to be a flirtation with the exotic rather than an attempt at any genuine intercultural understanding. So somebody like myself who comes from the US via Spain, by the way, so that phone call actually came from Madrid, Spain, where I had been teaching for a couple of years. And again, my husband said, oh, you would love Hong Kong. It is so interesting, which is my husband's code for, I really want to do this. Now let's see if we can figure out a way to make it work for you. And indeed, because of the story that Priscilla told you, I was able to come and build a life in Hong Kong, and I'm very grateful for that. But as I did that, I became interested in other people who had my same background, and that did lead me to Harriet Lowe. And so I always joke about my first book was Americans are seen as quite self-centered, right? This notion of like, but enough about you, let's talk, but enough about me, let's talk about you. And what I did was, enough about me, let's talk about you. What do you think of me, right? So the you being people in Asia, in Hong Kong and Macau, Chinese people, Macanese people, British, Europeans, all sorts of people within these interesting communities in both Macau and Hong Kong had very particular ideas of who Americans, and particularly who American women were. And so I was curious, where did these ideas come from? And obviously a lot of them come from popular culture and from Hollywood cinema, but also they came through historical experience, missionaries, teachers, merchant daughters and wives like Rebecca Kinsman and Harriet Lowe in Macau. So when I looked at Harriet Lowe's diaries, Marchetti's comment still holds, right? She sees herself as this cosmopolitan woman who she's very interested in what she sees in Macau, but honestly, what she sees is British women, and she's always comparing herself with British women in terms of fashion and language and just general presentation. And I think the Bridget Jones comparison is apt for sure. And she doesn't see other people. She does, and she writes about Chinese men, but it's as if she doesn't really see them. And I have been guilty of some of those same preoccupations, that I'm so focused on what is in front of me, or I have a particular background. And so I had to confront my own sort of US-centric bias. And I think right now we are in a moment where things have changed. China is in a different place today than it was certainly when Harriet Lowe was in Macau, but China is in a different place than when I first came in 1993. So I joke with my colleagues that I'm interested in traditional archives, but I became quite fascinated by the pajama archive. That means I sit at home and I watch a lot of movies and television, and I was interested in different representations, what we would call transnational representations, cross-cultural representations. So what does Hollywood think of Asia? And tonight we'll think about Macau. But what does Macau and Hong Kong think of the US? And then what happens in this recent period when we have filmmakers from various parts of the world who are also part of a global economy that wants to make money, build bridges, access markets. Where's history in that conversation, right? Where is gender and race and class? And so we would use the term intersectionality, right? Where does gender inform race and class? And by the way, these are terms that in the US right now are quite politically charged. So there are a lot of people that would listen to me and say, oh, she's one of those woke academics, right? I don't know that I am. I think the background that I come from probably leaves me. I grew up in a very conservative part of the US, but I do think that there is something to being plunked down here as a US citizen that made me see what those intersections of identity and institutions, what they meant for all people in different times and places. So that's a rather long-winded preface to what I want to do, but we're going to sort of zoom from the 19th century right up to the current moment in terms of thinking about how Macau is represented in the last couple of decades of the 21st century. And I want to, before I move on, I want to read you, apologies, I'm going to read you a quote instead of you seeing a slide, but Gina Marchetti actually collaborated with another scholar who taught at Macau University, Tan Sikkim, and then a scholar in Korean studies, Aaron Munyon Park, and they have edited this large volume, the Palgrave, I can't remember if it was Palgrave or Rutledge anyway, and have an essay in it, but a monster volume on Asian cinema. And in the preface to this, they have this phrase that has been really important for me in my work on movies and cultural history more generally. They write, "It is not the linguistic, ethnic, racial, religious, moral, philosophical, cultural, or even culinary similarities that hold the region together. Rather, it is the push and pull of history, the power of globalization, and the legacy of colonialism, racism, and diaspora." And so I think when I say that Macau has been missing from my work, Priscilla was kind enough to point me in the direction of readings and movies from the post-war Cold War period, but also some more contemporary readings. And I learned for the first time about Luso-tropicalism, which is a Portuguese Macanese sort of response to or flow with Orientalism or American exceptionalism or Hollywood exceptionalism. So that was definitely a gap in my knowledge. And I am apologizing because I'd hoped to say more about Portuguese cinema tonight. And I am not going to be able to because there's a lot to know and I don't know it yet, but I'm happy to converse with you in the Q&A and know more about these links between Portuguese cinema, Macanese cinema, and the co-production economy, and the sorts of representations that I'm talking about tonight. But my focus really will be Hong Kong, Macau connections, keeping in mind that we're talking back to Hollywood as well. So I'll start with Hollywood, talk about Hong Kong and Hollywood and Macau and Hong Kong and Macau, and then we'll think about the ways in which are we seeing a mainlandization of cinema? There are a lot of folks who are very worried, and rightfully so, that Hong Kong cinema has been killed off. Or, Hong Kong cinema, by the way, is always in the process of dying, right? Not unlike feminism. There's always a lot of anxiety about it. And there's no doubt that something called the golden era in Hong Kong cinema exists. But I also think that we are in an interesting moment as well. So, next slide. So if we think about Hollywood's Macau as being the slides that I showed, so probably one of the most famous representations of Hollywood's Macau would be the film Macau from, what is it, the 30s? I don't even.
Early 50s.
Thank you. And so there are earlier newsreels and representations of Macau, but it's with the Bond films and then films like Soldier of Fortune. And in the 50s and 60s, Macau is seen as an exotic outpost in an exotic outpost, right? And Hong Kong will end up sort of exoticizing Macau as well. But I remember my mother saying to me, "Come and watch this film, Love is a Many Splendored Thing. It will teach you what you need to know about Hong Kong and Macau." Imagine that, right? So we're clearly in a different day and age from that moment, but there's been a lot of terrific work on cinema and cultural production in the post-war Cold War period. And Priscilla, Professor Roberts, has been an important part of helping us think about the historical linkages as well as the cultural linkages in this period. So the U.S. involvement, whether it's through CIA or diplomatic connections or business connections that morphed with politics and surveillance, right? There's been a lot of great work on the ways in which Cold War culture coming out of the post-war period oftentimes focused more on Europe than it did on Asia. And so that is changing now. And so work in Sinophone studies, or there's an entire methodology on Asia as method that's really important. Work being done by younger generations of scholars who they're very fluent in both Western and Asian academic lingo and culture, right? There's just a lot of really interesting work on film in this period. So I'm fast forwarding through that. I've written a little bit about the Cathay studios and the ways in which they represented women in this period, but there is more to come. Now, in preparing for tonight, a couple of things A few things informed what I'm saying here. First of all, this Hong Kong cinema through a global lens. I was part of a team that put together a MOOC, a massive online open course on Hong Kong cinema through a global lens. So when I write my book, An Autumn's Tale, so it's based on Mabel Jung Ting's actual experience as a young filmmaker in New York City. She will later, well, actually, she will meet at NYU. She will meet Alex Law, who is another very important Hong Kong filmmaker who sadly we lost 2 summers ago. So I was introduced to this world of the migration melodramas basically in the lead up to the handover to the resumption of Chinese sovereignty in 1997 in Hong Kong. There are all these very interesting films. And of course, we can talk about the Hong Kong New Wave and the Hong Kong Second Wave. So everybody knows names like Wong Kar-wai. And more people today know An Hui, right? But there are a lot of very important filmmakers that made films about their experiences going from Hong Kong to somewhere else, to London, to New York, to Sydney, and back again. So these migration melodramas chronicle diaspora stories, Clara Law's Farewell China, Alan Fong's Just Like Weather, lots of really, really important filmmakers that tell stories loosely based on their own history. So historians, we have a complicated relationship with film, right? When you go to the movies and you see based on a true story, you know there's not necessarily going to be all the truth. And there's no such thing as objective truth anywhere. But movies, of course, take a certain license with the truth. So I want to be very careful about talking about the historical value of these films in terms of this is what happened, when, where, why, and how. But I think these films are incredibly important because they do something that I teach in class called historical work. They chronicle what is on the minds of the people making the films, or what are we learning about the places chronicled in the films, assuming that we're looking at actual footage rather than something in a sound studio. But for instance, so when I write the book about An Autumn's Tale, which is a 1987 film, it's a fascinating moment because you have Taiwanese Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, mainland Chinese, and American-born Chinese all hanging out together in Chinatown. And there's a lot of hope about the future of the US-China relationship. And then 2 years later, you will have Tiananmen. And then several years after that, you will have September 11, 2001. And so the cityscape that you see in 1987 is fascinating. The World Trade Center is still there. Attitudes between and among different groups of Chinese and Asian diaspora community become considerably more complicated. And so An Autumn's Tale captures really important historical moments, right? So that's the sort of work that I have been doing. And so we have the Cold War period, we have the pre-handover period, and then we should think about pre-handover Macau, because there are films that definitely do some of the same work. I don't know them as well, but I'll talk about a couple of them. But the MOOC gave me an opportunity. I finally had to move beyond my comfort zone. I always joke about, I write about the films nobody wants to write about because they're not serious enough academically. So romances, romantic comedies, fluffy films. Fluff is important, right? I mean, keep in mind, people thought Jane Austen was fluffy, right? Women's literature in the 19th century was dismissed. So we want to be very careful about the ways in which films like chick flicks or romantic comedies oftentimes get dismissed, but they have important messages and they do important historical work. Same thing happens when we think about martial arts and action films, although martial arts and action has received much more respect among the academic community for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about later if you're interested. But nonetheless, Hong Kong cinema punches above its weight in helping us think about these global flows, the push and pull of history, and these legacies of migration, racism, sexism that Marchetti and Tan and Mannion Park helped us think about at the beginning of my chat. So in thinking about tonight, I watched a lot of gambling movies. I watched a lot of casino movies. Quick show of hands. How many of you watch casino movies at all? How many of you even care about this genre? Not a hand in the house, right? Gambling movies. Action movies. Action movies. Martial arts cinema. None of this. All right, very interesting. But there are a lot of these sorts of films, right, that have done very well. And unfortunately, they have rendered Macau in a very, very particular, narrow, and, as academics would say, problematic light. But there's a lot to them. And the book that I am writing now, which is taking a really, really long time, is a book about men and representations of men in popular culture. And here's the thing. I wrote the book on women as part of my dissertation. It came rather quickly. It's taken me more than 10 years to finish this book on men. Part of that's because I had other things going on, but also I am a woman and I think I know about men, but maybe I don't, right? So there's this whole conversation around feminism and the ways in which can men be feminists, or is feminism anti-male? And I think those are interesting conversations. But what I appreciate about studying feminism and gender and masculinities in this part of the world is there is amazing work being done on Chinese masculinities and Asian masculinities. It is cross-generational, it is cross-cultural and transnational. So there's been a lot of new work that has come out. And whether we're talking queer studies or more conventional manhood and masculinity studies, or the ways in which feminist studies is looking at men's lives, there's a lot to think about and know. So you're not particularly interested in genre, but there are a lot of these genres, but there are a lot of people who are, and they're doing some interesting work about the sorts of historical and cultural messages we see in these films. What I believe is that, and this is, we will get to Tracy Choi in a minute, who is a Hong Kong filmmaker, a Macau filmmaker who was educated both in Taiwan and Hong Kong. She brings a transnational, feminist, queer perspective to the history of Macau that I think will lead the way for a lot of future work. But what I do think is that a lot of these stories do need to be told. Stanley Ho's life is memorialized in the 2 casino tycoon films. And I'm sure there are a lot of really interesting Stanley Ho related films that could be made. I taught one of his granddaughters at Hong Kong U. I think there are many of you in this audience who know people who are affiliated with the gambling industry, the casino industry, business as it happens in Macau. These are really important stories that can and should be told. Tracy Choi asks us to do some of that, and she does that with her own film, Sisterhood, which we'll get to in a bit. Anyway, whether it's Johnny To's Vengeance, whether it's the Chow Yun Fat and Nick Chung, Vegas to Macau, The God of Gamblers, right? There is a lot of history located in these films. One of the criticisms of Hong Kong cinema, I think my mic, I just need to talk forward to the mic. One of the criticisms of Hong Kong cinema currently is people say, because of censorship laws, because of the way things have changed, we're still bringing out the old stars, right? The iconic proven, the Andy Laus, the Chow Yun Fat, the Aaron Kwok, Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, right? I'm happy to see these men continue doing this work, and the women, their counterparts in older generations as well. But that's not all that's going on. Obviously, there's a younger generation coming up as well. But what I think would be very interesting is to think about the ways in which these stars have performed in these films, these stories about Macau over time, and then how the stories are changing as these stars change as well. I have lots of company in thinking about this sort of work. So a scholar who is Baptist University, I believe, or Polytechnic. Anyway, like Wanpeng. She has written a lot on men and masculinity in Hong Kong cinema. And she says, she helps us think about this question of historical heft at the movies. She says, you know, cinema does not simply and directly mirror society, but a highly successful commercial cinema like Hong Kong's does organically intertwine with the collective emotions of local society, and the industry's abrupt changes are often triggered by changes in the social environment. So I want you to think about changes in Macau's social environment and what is triggered in cinema as a result of changes in Macau, whether it is the handover, whether it is the ways in which new contracts were given to new casino operators. And then we can think about COVID, the knock-on impact of what happened in Hong Kong to Macau, right? So I just think about change and cinema. And I think there's so much more to be said about change in Macau. Now, before we get to some of the more commercial blockbustery co-productions, I just want to point out that cultural workers, directors, actors, archivists have spoken, written, and made movies about the importance of Macau in their lives. So the first I mentioned An Hui already, but her 1990 autobiographical, semi-autobiographical film, Song of the Exile, shows the importance of her childhood, her young childhood in Macau, the tensions that existed for her Japanese mother and the Chinese family living in both Macau and then also later across the border in the Chinese mainland as well. But her later films have continued to pick up on some of these same themes, and she herself has talked about the importance of Macau for her work. Evans Chan, who is a more independent filmmaker, he splits his time between New York. He used to say between New York and Hong Kong. He's not sure if he can return to Hong Kong anymore. But he made a series of films called China Decolonized, and his second film in the series was Adios Macau. And he said, you know, I wanted to go back to my childhood. He was born in the mainland, but spent a chunk of his early childhood, again, like An Hui, in Macau. And he said, I have this nostalgia for Macau, but I also have this anxiety about how Macau was changing. So he came and he made this documentary, and he does narrative film as well as documentary. So it's quite a special film. And he said, but I couldn't get anybody to talk to me. Everybody was really worried and they didn't want to go on record. He said, so I talked to historians, and I talked to people in the arts community, and I talked to teachers, and I talked to people on the street. And so you get a sense of what people are feeling prior to 1999. And it really is quite an extraordinary film. But also, Chan does all sorts of interesting things with music in his cinema. So he uses Portuguese fado, and he also celebrates Lan Bum-ching's work. She was commissioned to write something for the handover. So he mixes musical styles in the same way that there is mixing and hybridity of culture and language and all sorts of histories in Macau as well. So very interesting. And one person that is interviewed in the film is Law Carr, who was a part of the film industry in Hong Kong cinema in both of the periods that I've talked about earlier, but also he's gone on to be the archivist. He's basically the force behind the Hong Kong Cinema Archive in North Point in Hong Kong. And he says it was going to cinema in Macau. That's where I became a cinephile. So I just think there are people who make films who talk about the importance of Macau. Now, this is quickly, I mentioned before, we're going to take ourselves finally into the 21st century and think about what has happened since both handovers in Hong Kong and Macau, but also after SARS, leading up to, well, two financial crises, right? Changes in Hollywood, and a very important ordinance for a lot of businesses, but particularly for filmmakers, CEPA, the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement in 2003, which said that there would no longer be a limit, an embargo on the number of films coming from Hollywood or Hong Kong, that while Hollywood films would still be embargoed, Hong Kong films would be able to escape that by having a certain percentage of either people in front of the camera or behind the camera producing in certain ways, that then there could be sort of unlimited Hong Kong cinema that is sold, circulated in the mainland. So this becomes an incredibly important moment for a dying Hong Kong film industry. But of course, there's all sorts of debate and controversy about what does this mean? Is this as I said before, is this the end of a smaller, more locally based Hong Kong cinema? Is it the mainlandization of Hong Kong cinema? So critique of filmmakers, or not critique, harsh criticism of filmmakers like Peter Chan, who make films, American Dreams in China, and then more recently, Leap, the story of Lan Ping and the Chinese women's volleyball team. Mabel Chung got some of that criticism when she made The Sung Sisters, which was one of the earliest co-productions based on one of China's those amazing prominent women, right? So lots of conversation about CEPA, Hollywood's continued influence. My students, by and large, I have to convince them to go and watch Hong Kong cinema. I put it in front of their faces. Given a choice, they will choose Hollywood blockbusters. When I asked them what the last historical movie was they saw, seriously, a couple of them said Spider-Man and Iron Man. All right? Really? I mean, Wonder Woman, I could even go that far, right? Because there is actually a story about the creator of Wonder Woman, right? Nonetheless, my point is Hong Kong cinema matters and does all sorts of really important work, including incorporating Hollywood aesthetics, lending its personnel, its choreography, its technology, right? But we don't often think about that. And Macau gets lost in this shuffle, but I think it's a really important part of the story. So I look forward to you telling me what you think CEPA has meant for Macau. And a response to sort of the post-COVID period, and I would argue the post-protest period, is there's an injection of capital into movies in Hong Kong, into the independent movie scene, that is really important, and I think livening things up. So films like A Guilty Conscience, or Chilly Laugh Story, or A Light Never Goes Out. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, and I should have the Chinese titles, but I think independent cinema is having a moment. Younger generations are having a moment in cinema in Hong Kong, and CEPA continues to be a driver as well. Anyway, Gary Bettinson, who is actually a scholar in the UK, he and I had a conversation not too long ago, and I said, do you still stand by this quote? Because after the protest, do you still really believe that, Hong Kong's film industry is not so much broken with its past as channeled them into distinct modes of production? And he says yes. He says he really does not think that this is an end. It is a transitional period. He says those claiming that Hong Kong cinema has been demolished or diminished by recent industrial change err in their judgment. Not least, they underestimate the resourcefulness and integrity of Hong Kong filmmakers. Despite claims to the contrary, the fertile legacies of Hong Kong cinema live on. What are the fertile legacies of Macau's influence in this flow? I think that's something that I think we need to think more about. I also want to position Macau in a larger conversation about Pan-Asia cinema stories. And this is where the gender angle and the feminism will come back again. I've spent a lot of time thinking about and answering to students, family members, professionals about, is feminism a relevant way of thinking about lives, particularly for women in Asia? So I would have people tell me when I first arrived, oh, feminism, that's a Western thing, that's an American thing. And there's no doubt that it is an American and a Western thing, but it is also an Asian thing and a global thing, right? And so I've been delighted to read, first of all, China's feminist tradition. Mainland Chinese feminist tradition is so powerful and important, and I feel like that history is being lost in the mainland as well as elsewhere, but that's another conversation. Except for when we talk about a fifth-generation filmmaker who made an interesting film about Macau in a bit. But a woman named Adeline Lim, who is now teaching in Singapore, she did a dissertation at Hong Kong U, and she wrote about feminism in Hong Kong, in the NGO movements, and she said that she believes that for a lot of people in the West, feminism is an identity. She feels like in Asia, feminism becomes a strategy. So whether you accept that or not, it's just interesting to think about uses of feminism and anti-feminism, the ways in which it gets weaponized to keep women in place. And we see this very much right now in the US as well, right? So this isn't this conversation about Asian values or traditional society. Patriarchy knows no borders, right? And the tradition, the back and forth between tradition and modernity, that is a global conversation. Anyway, so these films pick up on what it means to be young in rising Asia, aspiring, but also sometimes at odds with your parents' generation, or angry at an educational system that you saw as authoritarian and uninspiring, harsh, right? Or worse, abusive. So whether we're talking Bollywood film like Three Idiots, which blew up in China in a huge way, the Taiwanese You Are the Apple of My Eye, American Dreams in China. Bunny Drops is a Japanese film based on a longer series and an anime cartoons about a single father who adopts a young girl and what it means for him and his career. Kim Ji-young, born 1982, first a novel and then a film in Korea, again, ignites conversations between wives and husbands, fathers and daughters, aunties, partners, all sorts of things. And then Shanghai Calling. There's an interesting, we're having a moment right now in Asian American cinema, right? Whether it's Everything Everywhere All at Once, or going back to Crazy Rich Asians and before. But there's a whole lot of independent cinema that is trans-Pacific, where you have people who would see themselves, some of them would identify themselves as expatriates, other as members of the Asian or Chinese diaspora, but making films about what does it mean to work in China at the end of the 20th and early 21st century. So Macau is a part of this larger conversation about globality, not just globalization, but globality, the state of being global. So you saw already Finding Mr. Right in the last slide, but obviously the follow-up, the Book of Love, Finding Mr. Right 2, half of it took place, or it starts in Macau, right? Tongwei. And let's talk about the ways in which Tongwei has become an important receptacle for stories about gender and change and economics. And so Finding Mr. Right basically is her comeback film after she's banned from work after doing Lust Caution, right? So the mainland allows this film, Finding Mr. Right. And that is in no small part because of Shui Shalu, who is a really important woman director from Shanghai originally, who knows how to work with an authority structure, but also tell a good story. And she knows how to use actors to do that. The male lead has had his own problems in the Me Too era, which I will not say a lot about. But so there are stories behind the camera as well as stories on the screen. But what I think is interesting is that Macau starts to look a little bit different by this point in time. And to be fair, this is happening in the earlier 21st century as well. Films like Isabella or Butterfly, which actually foreground same-sex desire, lesbian relationships, but also women having power, even though they are seen as being powerless in certain societal structures. So women who work in massage parlors, sex workers, daughters of wealthy men who may seem to be living lives of privilege, who actually have a lot of difficulty and experience all sorts of complications in their lives. But this film, for me, it made me think about Macau in a slightly different way, but it's still very blockbustery. And just like Hong Kong would other Macau in certain ways, I think mainland directors oftentimes other Macau as well. And that's going to be something that we're going to be having to think about for a long time. So finally, we get to, for me, what is the money shot of this whole experience? And I look forward to having, some of you have actually met Tracy Choi, I know who she is, and I've read about her, and I look forward to seeing her more recent work. But I spent a lot of time with the 2016 film Sisterhood, because this period of time between really 2009, and then I would take it up to, let's take it up to 2018, but 2016, I mean, there's some very interesting films made in the teens, and Sisterhood is certainly among them. And this is Choi's first feature film, and what an arrival it is, right? And it brings together very prominent Hong Kong actors like Gigi Leung and Fish Liu from various generations. And it's a very subtle story. And when you listen to Choi talk about the film, she said, I am an avowed feminist, I am openly queer, but when I made this film, I didn't necessarily feel the need to, say a whole lot about lesbian identity. She said, I left it kind of open. What I wanted people to think about was relationships between women and what it means to be a sister in certain ways. So for people who study cinema, this is a flip on, we talk about the male gaze of the camera, right? And we talk about Orientalism. So this is pushing back against some deep historical bias against the objectification of women. But there's also something, Alison Bechdel, who is a graphic artist and also a very famous feminist, she's had something called the Bechdel test. She says a film passes the Bechdel test if it has two women, at least two women, talking to each other about something other than a man. And so this film passes the Bechdel test, right? And it's a really, really interesting film. But what's important about it, in addition to everything that has been said, for somebody like myself who's looking at men's lives and roles, is the men in this film are evolving because the women in their lives have different dreams, different desires, and they have expectations that are different from their mothers and their grandmothers. That's not to say their mothers and their grandmothers didn't have dreams. They did. But the ability to make those dreams a reality, that seems to be happening more in these films, and one could argue in society at large. Although, as Priscilla rightly pointed out, the question of how much change there has actually been is open to conversation. So, 2 years later, in 2018, we get to, anybody seen A City Called Macau? Show of hands. Nobody has seen it. All right, well, good. You have it to look forward to still. I want to grab my notes for this one because, so Li Xiaohong, which she's, for a time you could argue was the most prominent female director in China, and still very much a force. She makes what I think we could call a main melody film. So the term main melody goes to, I don't believe it was, I'm not sure, it predates Xi Jinping and the China Dream, but this idea that the Chinese government supports films that sing a certain song, that there are certain messages or certain melodies that get repeated in the film. Now, the most famous of these films are the Wolf Warrior films, where the main melody is clearly nationalism, China's strength, go away sissy boys, right? We don't want any of that. But there are a lot of other films that sing main melodies of different kinds as well. And so I think there's some very interesting feminist messages in these mainland melody films about corruption. And we're seeing this in Hong Kong as well, that you can tell stories about overcoming challenge, abuse, trauma in more general and universalized ways that aren't so particularly focused on events that will trip the censors, right? Having said that, the filmmakers talked about it took a long time to get this film passed by the censors because gambling is not a theme that is screened in China, right? And so all of these Hong Kong gambling films don't fly, although of course they're pirated and produced other ways, but this film did. And this is a fascinating film because not only do you have a female protagonist at the center of the action, but you have a range of men in different positions in society. One is an artist, one is a developer, and you actually have the protagonist going to different parts of China trying to collect debts. So the woman who is the lead here is a broker. And there's a longer story about the ways in which women entered brokering in the period between the handover and then when the laws changed. I think it was in 2012. So there's this really interesting period of time. And you have, again, several generations of both Hong Kong and mainland actors who power this film, and it's quite interesting. I'm going to wrap up now with coming back to the boys and back to an icon, Chow Yun-fat, as well as several other very well-known Hong Kong actors as well. But the very recent One More Chance, which, depending on where it airs, it's also Be Like Water, the English translation. I've heard it's Don't Call Me God of Gamblers or Be Like Water, right? There were a lot of different titles of this film, but on the poster in Hong Kong, One More Chance. And it's a fascinating film because we all have, well, not you, but a lot of people who've watched these other gambling films have recollections of seeing Chow Yun-fat in God of Gamblers, in other casino and action films. And so he's always played a range of roles. But so Figgy in An Autumn's Tale, the film that I write about, this character in One More Chance reminds me very much of the Figgy that I see in An Autumn's Tale in 1987. But Macau, like in Tracy Choi's films, Macau becomes a character with more nuance, where you actually see neighborhoods, you see relationships. It's not as nuanced as the work that Choi does, to be sure, let's be clear. But for my money, this is a different Hong Kong cinema take on Macau. And it's also a film that looks at autism, that looks at single fatherhood. There are very few women in this film, but they are not there for particular reasons. The mom of the autistic son is basically dying of cancer. And there is one woman who is a social worker who enters as well. So you don't see women, really. They are in bit parts. But the dynamic here is about men from different generations and different relationships, and father-son relationships, both in families, in triads, in schools. Again, it's a blockbuster. It's a commercial film. But I think it's doing quite interesting cultural work. I think that is it. I will stop here. But Priscilla mentioned that I have grandchildren, and I spent a lot of time yesterday with the youngest, who's baby Ari, who is learning to talk. And when she hasn't had enough of something, she's learning a little sign language, right? She'll go, more, 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 right? So when I think about these films, and I was like, more Macau films, right? And you probably know more than I do, but as I've said before, I'm grateful for the chance to have thought about these films, and they will enter my work in fuller force. So that's it.
Okay, well, I realize this is still very much work in progress.
It is, for sure. And you're all going to tell me what I got wrong.
Has anybody seen any of these films?
Is anybody going to go see any of them? That's the question. No? Okay.
I've seen one on a casino story. That was the name is Simple Casino, dated 1998, about the local gangster. And it was the only one I thought. It was in the pre and over period, which was quite interesting.
I'm glad you thought it was interesting. Can you tell me what you thought was interesting about it? Because I'm curious to know.
Because the pre and over period was very, very important for those who were living here, right? And the movie had a lot of political implications. And it was quite, I think we could not see it. It was shown in Hong Kong.
Interesting.
And we could buy the copy, pirate copies
I
crossing
believe
the border.
I believe it was bankrolled by that gangster, Broken Tooth.
Yes, yes.
Who
It was based on his real life.
A lot of these films are. And I think the question of how do you get at who funds and the messages, and there are always political messages there, and then there's always a discussion of, are we overreading the politics? Are we misreading, right?
And it was filmed in Macau.
So interesting. I think that the book that I'm writing is about leadership, particularly, and I feel like there has to be a whole chapter on leadership on the low road or on the shadow road, right? I don't know how we account for that, but we have to.
Hi, excuse. So, for the movies about Zhou Renfa or the God of a Casino, I think quite very, very popular in mainland. Because anyway, I study high school in college in Guangzhou. So, my hometown was is the ideal for our first boyfriends. Because at that time they said, wow, what happened? So manhood for the boy influenced the young students growing up a lot. Yeah, that's true. For many cinemas you present, I think super hot in mainland at that time. I'm not so sure because Mr. Louis mentioned maybe in Macau or Hong Kong not so popular, but in mainland at that time because just opening up. So many Hong Kongese, Macauese cinema is just entering in mainland because of since a long time after the Cultural Revolution, the lack of the culture cinema or works from Western culture, I think, that time. So that's why I say it's quite popular. Yeah. But just like you mean, at that time, they don't talk about much about the woman or the gender or anything like that, because for the mainland culture, they said the hero, they don't need woman. They don't talk about woman. They said because the woman or gender something, you made the man weaker. So they don't let the topic about the woman or beauty something to influence the so-called soldiers experiment. That's something interesting.
There's a lot interesting in your comments, Amelie.
Yeah. You can see the literature from Chinese literature. Normally the heroes, the superhero, they cannot have the influence from women. Otherwise, they said, this man is too weak. It's definitely different from the Western culture.
There's also this really, I think, one reason why it's so important to unpack, to sort of decolonize, de-Americanize this whole genre is because the template for manhood in China, I mean, if you think, I'm not an expert, but the Wenwu, the poet scholar, or, and the martial warrior, that a man can be more than one thing. But then there are also these real anxieties about women as well. But I also wanted to pick up on your point about going from Guangzhou, or Hong Kong movies coming to China. I teach some master's students at Hong Kong U, and I'm teaching a Hong Kong cinema history course. And it's the students from just across the border who know all these films. The Hong Kong students don't know them, but the mainland students do. And so this period of reform and opening up and what was available and who knew what, who saw what when, how they saw it, it's a really important story. And I don't know if people are writing about that, and I just don't know the work, but it's so important. Thank you.
Hello. It was great listening to some of your views about this evolution, about how Macau was seen through the movies. However, you briefly mentioned a film that I think perhaps will deserve a better approach or a better significance for this dialogue in the 21st century, which is Isabella, the way as Isabella saw Macau. And I think it was rather important, the film, because being by the aesthetic approach, the Wong Kar-wai's influence, all these kind of things, but also about the subject matter and the way as women and the relevancy of women as a key role in this film, somehow I think opened the way for Tracy Choi's approach to the film that she produced. So
100% agree.
Well, I would suggest a deeper, let's say, approach in this kind of presentation, because Isabella may bring a better understanding for the general audience, not here in Macau, perhaps they've seen, but also here in Macau, about how Macau was portrayed in the 21st century and the relevancy of the story. It's not about stereotypes. It's not blockbuster. It's not about strictly directly about gaming, but it's the side effects of gaming which make it rather interesting. So I was expecting a little bit more focus on Isabella because it struck me a lot, but you mentioned it, and just a suggestion to revisit Isabella and its role in the portraying Macau in the 21st century. Thank you.
I think it's so important. I have a confession to make. I had a hard time. I finally saw it 3 nights ago, and it's incredibly important. There is no doubt about it. And I would say not only, and Choi acknowledges that as well. The influence. And also, and Butterfly, but Isabella is certainly more important. You know, the thing that's so funny is I haven't thought about women and women's films as much because I've been looking at representations of men and manhood. And so a lot of these films slipped beneath the radar for me. And you're absolutely right. If I don't even know that I'll do this again. I think it's a little bit scary to talk about Macau and cinema in Macau, right? But I do hope people pick up on it, and Isabella is incredibly important for sure, for all the reasons that you mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ford, for your really inspirational lectures. And
now here comes the criticism. You've got to give me the hard criticism.
No. But I'm really excited because even within the University of Macau, there's really like a few opportunities to find the scholars to share some studies, mainly focusing on Macau's cultural products and even feminist theories. And so I'm really excited to have you come here to brief these lectures. And your topic is really interesting because about through cinemas to see Macau. And even you mentioned most of the movies is before or around the establishment of SAR and also in new centuries. But from my research and during like in the 50s, 1950s to 1960s, the most like enjoyable movements for another movement activities in daily life for the Macau's local women, they really love to see a movie, go to the film, that's called a theaters. Actually, they not like today's to go to the cinemas, but and they go to a place where to go to some organization's house sitting together and to see a film. And not only the films like come from but many films come from Hong Kong, of course, from Shaw's business, and also a lot of productions, but also from mainland, from Americans, and a lot of local women. They became the fans of these movies, and also they organize some magazines. They read letters to each other, talk about the movies. So I thought it's really interesting topics about seeing Macau's movies, and also.
So before you go on, will you include the discussion of women and the movie viewing in your work? Is that a part of what you're doing?
I mentioned a lot because they through the cinemas, they through the films, they started like a new style of the women's figures, and especially from the Americans movie, but also from Hong Kong's, and also they have opportunities like to trans-regional go to Hong Kong's to seek a job.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and especially in previous times, to see a movie is like more expensive for the local, especially the lower class women's. But in 1950s, benefited from the women's movement hosted by the local elite women's. So most of them have chance to see the movies, to see the films, and a lot of grassroots women they try to seek the fashions, to make clothes for themselves, and to learn how to do the hairstyles because of they seeing these movies, seeing these cultural productions, and also of course they regenerate the feminities and comparative to the masculinities. So that's really interesting dynamics.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
My question is grassroots movie going different in Macau than it is in Hong Kong? Do you have a sense of that yet?
The grassroots moving show, the movies productions were.
But when you were talking about women they would have access to the movies. Grassroots went through smaller informal screenings. And I'd be interested in knowing if it was different, because one thing that I understand is that there is a small house screening, a culture of cinematiques. We have a couple in Hong Kong, but we were talking before about the ways in which this is embedded in the cultural scene here. So it'd be interesting to know the difference. And also the ideology, right? Because in Hong Kong, there's leftist films, rightist films, and they're organizational sponsors. But if these are these women crossing political boundaries when they're watching these films, or it sounds like they are, right?
Yeah, actually, some like in Macau and especially in 1950s, and there have of course they're different from the political groups, and that there was competitions, and especially for women who join in the left wings organizations, they will mainly mainly focusing on the movies from mainland, of course, played by their organizations, but actually sometimes and in their daily life, on the one hand, they will participate in the movements, participate in the organization, so they have chance to see the movies from mainlands. But on the other hand, in their daily life without the organizations, movements, they also really like to see the Hong Kong's movies, and they will record their feelings after movies from Hong Kong and also from United States, on newspapers or their diaries. So even they have their political maybe identities, and
Yeah.
but it's really flexible for their chance to see a lot of things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So looking forward to your work. Really.
Yeah, and also you mentioned like the masculinity like regenerated from the gambling's movie. Because actually I saw a lot when I was a child because I grew up in Guangdong.
Again, that
of course.
Guangdong connection.
Yeah, and like my generations when I was a child, a lot of students from primary school or middle schools, for little boys, we really like to follow the like Zhou Xingchi or the God of Gamblings and to play cards or to copy their words or copy the behaviors. And yes,
Thing.
but also a kind of like a transregional figures where transregional regenerating the masculinities from Hong Kong to mainland or from Macau to mainland, and especially concerned about after the Mao era, after cultural revolutions, the masculinities, Chinese masculinities, especially for the mainland men's, they actually some scholars will raise that they got hurt.
Yeah.
Yes, and so it's also another way for men from locals or even from young generations to recreate themselves, to recreate their masculinities for taking cultural products, taking figures, taking that kind of a hero, playing in new eras to recover their previous one.
No, and that recuperation project continues, doesn't it? And a lot of these more recent films, I mean, I think of American Dreams in China, that boardroom scene where the New Orient student, the New Orient teachers are saying to the white guys, basically, look, you have no idea what we have to go through. And there's this revenge narrative about it, and it's a reclamation of a certain type of masculinity, which is different from what you're talking about. But the films they generate conversations, they offer models or anti-models, and I think there's a difference even between these films around 2016, 2017, and what we're seeing today. I think Macau changes rapidly, this region changes rapidly, and ideas, because of social media, because of whether you're comfortable or not with fluidity in gender and sexuality, you have to have a conversation about it, right? And I think we're just learning about what that means here as well as elsewhere.
May I raise questions for you topic?
Sure.
And also you mentioned before like you talked something about the Chinese feminisms, and before we have like long and maybe now long half-century scholarship to study on Chinese women's, and many scholars like Tani Barlow, Gail Hirsch-Shutters, they're focusing on Chinese women history and even theorizing the Chinese feminisms, like they're tracing the first generations of Chinese feminists from mainland, and also they come to Hong Kong, and even for my interest, I'm traced in like they also go to Macau, but my question is for Hong Kong, of course, and also you mentioned like some scholars they discuss the NGOs peer movements, movements, and also scholars could find what is the next house after 1949, where the Chinese feminists go. In Hong Kong, and also we knew that the fifth generations, not fourth or fifth generations in mainland, and also about a movie like directors Li Shaohong or the scholars like Dai Jinghua, many Chinese feminists they became directors, scholars, and but for mainland for Macau, I thought. After tracing for the socialist movements in Macau, and especially after the 123 incident after the 1966, and we didn't have a lot evidence or whatever evidence, primary sources, or the stories about Macau's feminists. And sometimes we got as maybe the stories ended after cultural revolutions because enter the new eras, into the post-war areas, Macau societies to gather great like transformations, and the social organizations, all the things change, and so we like miss the traces. So I wonder that, and did you find some things through the like Hong Kong's Macau or through the Macau's in the cinemas we can talk about the feminisms belong to Macau's people or belong to Macau's locals. But yes, that's my questions for this.
Okay, but if I understand your question, I'm not. First of all, you recounted a really important history, and I know nothing literally about feminism in Macau. And I can talk. We're not. I wrote about women in Macau in the 19th century, but then I know virtually nothing about 20th century. I know that, and nothing 21st century. I think Tracy Choi is somebody who is theorizing as she makes movies. So you would know more about what's happening. And I think the question of Portuguese influence is going to be important here, because I don't have a sense of Portuguese feminism. I know a little bit more about Spanish feminism, but I think there was a strong, if you're looking at grassroots, and when I arrived in 1993, there's the New Territories Inheritance Rights issue. And you have grassroots women, academic women, politicians. It was just a really interesting coalition of women. And some would say, we don't need feminism, we just need power. Others would say, we'll take these concepts from feminism. Others would say, we need a new term. That term is corrupted, right? But what I see happening now in classrooms, I'm always prepared that feminism is dead, that I will be the dinosaur, that like, I'm that one, right? Oh, she's still talking about that. But a younger generation of women coming from the mainland are very interested in talking about this at the same moment that the Chinese government is not keen, obviously, and women's and gender studies programs, if they're not shutting down, they're reinventing themselves in certain ways. So, and you know more about the academic scene here. So I would, put the question back to you. Is there something unique about Macau that can help different generations of feminists maneuver or theorize? And my work I would say, can film help with that? And I would say yes, as I think what film does oftentimes is it tells stories about women and men, and then and people of gender binary identity, and then people can make whatever sense of that they want. And of course, I think a lot of feminist theorizing going back to the 1970s comes from cinema, for sure. But I think this is a moment where Chinese scholars, I hope they reclaim a really important past, and I hope new generations take whatever makes sense. But all I know is I have a lot of students, and they're not all female identified or women. There are a lot of men, gay and straight, who are saying, I'm interested in this. I think it's important. So I don't know. Hurry and write your book. Hurry and write your book.
Okay. That's a long journey.
It is.
Well, I'm a bit unfamiliar with this particular subject of
But
movie.
you've lived a lot of this interesting history.
Yeah, what I'd like to comment is that I think as far as the cultural or the promotion of cultural identities and gender differentiations through a medium like movies is very much not prevalent in a society like Macau. The way in which the Macau people conduct their daily lives is very different to a larger city or people who live in mega cities or just reasonable city. Macau is a very provincial style of environment. There's a lot of personal contacts. People meet each other in a corner and they talk. People go to different places and they meet regularly. So it's like we call Macau like a city, but is a country town. So in a country town environment, I think that it's very obvious that the communication is not through media. It's usually what's communicated through word of mouth, and people get information a lot quicker by just meeting in a corner of Main Street. So I think the cultural part of Macau is perhaps not accurately being portrayed through, let's say in this case, movies or even television. Even though Macau actually it's not that long. I think the CRED-DM was introduced in the early 80s. There's hardly any program on television that capture the attentions of the general public. I think there's not that many programs that people will go home and watch it, like the soap opera and things like that. So I think that what Macau is lacking is some sort of effort by the cultural institution, like in this case, Institut Cultural, to promote not only through social media, but through tertiary institution as well as school, this sort of cultural identification. Because I think Macau is very much a person-to-person type of contact. It's very little through the media. But people like academics from outside of Macau are probably more interested to analyze what's happening. But I think you'll find that very few people would be able to identify the Macau film industry, for example. I don't think it's very well known. I'm not sure whether anybody here is familiar with all these movies that's made in Macau, but my circle I have kids in their mid-20s. They've never been to any movie that is made in Macau. So
and why is that because they're doing the around the corner?
Exactly. There's a lot of communication, but not through the social media.
Right.
So I think this is that easy to switch from what we call gossips, people that exchange ideas and talk about the day-to-day affairs, or going through a proper channel. Again, proper channel could be the news media or any other activities. And another thing that happens a lot is that when we have a situation like this, it should be much widely promoted. And I think that it's extremely interesting. But somehow the audience is very limited. Now, why is that? I think that Macau lacked that curiosity of listening to or coming to participate in things that are analyzed in an academic way. It's more like people like to know things, but very superficially. Nothing that's analyzed in depth. When, in this case, you have done a lot of research and you probably know a lot more than the local people about the local film industry. I can guarantee you that, a lot more. So, but anyway, I appreciate that very much. I think that what the effort that people from outside of Macau are doing about Macau is going to make Macau maybe a place that is more interesting than what it should be.
Well, thank you. Can I just quickly respond? Thank you for all of that, including sitting here tonight and listening. And I think the problem has been too many people from outside have narrated Macau. And so everybody in this room should write a screenplay. And I'm not joking, right? There is a hunger for stories, and a Chinese soft power infrastructure that will help bring those stories to light. But also what you say about if the person-to-person story is the story of Macau, then Macau is living every day, and maybe it doesn't matter what else happens, right? And my only identification, I lived in Madrid for 2 years, and when I visited Macau, it felt like such a relief from being in Hong Kong when I first arrived. So I think the everyday is so important, and we're saturated by media. And there's a lot of interesting scholarship on the everyday as well. But I think somebody like yourself, you have helped promote, and you will continue to help promote conversations, right? I think Hong Kong people are hard on Hong Kong. I heard some of the same things said about Hong Kong being a provincial place too. And I know Macau is different from Hong Kong. But I think the question becomes, Hong Kong is now, or Macau is a global place, right? There are people, whether or not you think of the casinos as being related to that person-to-person environment that you were talking about, the world has come to Macau, but there's also still, there are many Macaus, right? And you know them better than I do. But the stories here, the potential for stories, it's extraordinary. And I can't figure Macau out. I think it's a quandary, right? So I'm going to keep coming back and learning from all of you. But you tell me, what is the way forward here? Because maybe you need fewer academics coming from the outside. I don't know how you get people to show up at events like this, but lots of interesting stories here.
We need a better mailing list.
Just finish it off, digressing a little bit from the movie industry, or what the talents are in Macau. What you're saying is very correct. Actually, Macau is not known at all until not even in the 90s. Macau only became known when Las Vegas Sands implemented the first casino in Macau, which was in 2004. As recent as early 2000, I immigrated to Australia in 1971. I can ask 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, you will not find one that have heard about Macau.
Goes back
They've
to the
been to Hong Kong
spec.
many times. They would have been to Hong Kong many times, but never came to Macau. In the 70s, 80s, right up until the 2000s. Now everybody knows about Macau. Not even mainland Chinese people knows about Macau. I had one conversation back in the mid-90s with a professor of history from mainland China who did a PhD in the States. He was a dean in a department at University of Macau. He did not know there was such a thing as the Macanese. I couldn't believe it, and I was completely out of my brain. I said, "You are
I hope you set him
historian?"
straight, though.
No, but that's true. That's true. The mainland Chinese, when they look at people like us that can speak Cantonese fluently, now they're starting to know a little bit. So that's how limited knowledge has existed outside of Macau. Extremely rare. Can you imagine the Macanese, we call it a race. It's a very debatable situation because after 400 years, Australia has 300 years of history, and they call it, well, we call Australians as a race, or Americans, or Canadians. But the Macanese race as such, you have nearly 500 years of history. And my family's been here for over 200 years, right? So there's a debate as to Macanese should be called a race. And to finish it off, I did try very hard in the 90s because I came back from Australia in 1991 and I set up the Macanese Association. And I was so surprised that the Beijing central government knew so little about the Macanese. There was, I would say that very, very little. They relied nearly 100% on what the local people referenced to Macanese, which is, incredible, right? Incredible to a point that I really needed to educate the people from Xinhua, which is now the liaison group, about such a group of people called Macanese. So there's a lot of work to be done, but definitely not from locals, because locals are very afraid.
Oh, it's a tricky moment.
To make that sort of thing public.
Sure, sure. But start with the memoir, please. How about that? And then somebody will write a screenplay.
Anyway,
Thank you so much.
Well, we're
way
running
over.
a little bit over time, I'm afraid. There are a few nibbles outside if we wish to continue this discussion more informally. But at this point, I will thank our speaker for coming over
Thank you.
all the way from Hong Kong today. And I believe you need to go back tonight as well. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time and trouble to come here today. And I will look forward to hosting you again
Like that.
somewhere in Macau, here or at USJ or somewhere else. So let's continue the conversation.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
And thank all of you very much for staying to the bitter end, too.